so we'll just get going. I'll introduce myself again. I'm Sarah Vaya. I'm a professor and climate extension specialist at the University of Maryland. And today we're going to talk about regenerative agriculture. So something like the way I did it in the last webinar, it's basically, do we want this? Or do we want our landscape to look more like this and these? And I'll be laying out all those options as we go along. I will start with a little outline to first discuss about some current issues in agriculture. Agriculture is, well, we'll learn all about that. There are a few sector-wide issues that have arisen due to control of the sort of agricultural sector by agribusiness. And these issues are surprisingly similar to what crops up with the fossil fuel industry. We have a lot of lobbying, et cetera. Greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are huge. Land and water use very inefficient. Current agricultural practices reduce biodiversity and damage soil health. So we'll be talking about the alternative to some of these problems, or practices that help solve some of these problems, that are basically lumped under the term now regenerative agriculture. These are practices that improve soil health, sequester carbon, and increase biodiversity. And by improving soil health, they also boost the resilience of agriculture to climate change, particularly to flooding and drought. And I'll give you details about that in just a few minutes. And then as we go along, I'll be providing some solutions and recommendations. I want to point out that I've used 3 documents fairly extensively in preparing for this. These 2 books are both great. This is a more popular book by George Monbiot. He is an author and also a columnist for The Guardian. And there's just a ton of great information in here. This book by Peter Lehner and Nathan Rosenberg is a little more technical. They're both lawyers. And so this is really sort of lays out some of the problems and then some of the legal ramifications, which is also very interesting. And then this isn't a book, it's a report that I wrote and published back in 2021. And in this report, I go through a lot of examples and go into a lot of detail about how we can increase soil health. So as we go through the talk, what I'll do is I have a lot of examples from this report that I'll be showing you. And instead of going through and listing the citations for each one of the little points I make, I'll just refer to this and the page number. And if you're interested, there's a link here that you can use to download the report, and all of you will be getting a copy of the slide handout with the slides in there, and these links should all be hot in that, so you can go and download this if you are interested. Okay. Just to go through this relatively quickly, there are a number of structural problems. That really just means problems with policy and the way change occurs. U.S. agriculture is basically run by agribusiness, and the interests of these corporations are really prevailing. Lobbying by the big ag companies keeps regulation of agriculture low, and it favors profits of the corporate profits over the common good. This is not a new sort of line of thought for us. But the idea in agriculture is that it prioritizes yield at any cost. So what we have is large monocultures, which are really efficient to sort of work. They use extensive fertilizer, herbicide, and pesticides. So there's a lot of chemical inputs. The policies we have work against the interests of small to medium-sized farmers. That is not small farmers themselves, but small farms, small to medium-sized farms. For example, 99% of the 2019 Trump farm bailout went to the biggest farms. And these are basically generally run by non-Hispanic white males. So the little guys are really not getting a piece of the pie right now. There have been persistent racial inequalities in policies and USDA support. And this goes back 50 years at least. I'm not sure when the USDA was founded, but there always have been a lot of racial inequalities, which are still happening right now. Farm workers, as we know, are working in increasingly hostile weather, especially hot weather, and although they do most of the work, they don't really make a living wage. Programs to help farmers use the conservation practices that I'm going to describe are way underfunded. And so the majority of applicants get nothing. We want farmers to use these practices, but the USDA doesn't give out enough money. Well, they don't have enough money, and then they don't give out enough, so that the majority of farmers can actually use these. And finally, just as in the fossil fuel industry, the costs of agriculture and agricultural practices to the environment and to health are externalized. That is, they're not paid for by agribusiness or by the farmers. So they're put out there. If there's health problems, environment problems, say from fertilizer pollution, we all pay for that through our tax dollars. Okay. Let's start out by talking about global agricultural greenhouse gas, GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. So the agricultural sector, which basically is food, ag, and land use, is responsible for between 22 and 35% of global emissions, up to 1/3 of all global emissions. That is a lot. Globally, deforestation accounts for 11% of the emissions, and this is a lot. Methane from livestock, 5% of global emissions. Methane from rice, 2%. Growing rice generates methane from the wet rice paddies. Emissions from fertilizer and from the soil after tillage causes 3%. Transportation, processing, refrigeration, cooking, that's another 14%. So when you add all that up, it adds up to 35%. Throughout this talk, I have a lot of links that you can use as you go through the slides to get more information on a lot of the issues that I'll be discussing. 80% of all these emissions come from meat and dairy. And this is a sort of shocking statistics. If global cattle were a country, its emissions would rank number 2, right after China. So that just gives you an idea of how much meat and dairy are contributing to the whole climate change problem. All right. Again, I have a lot of pictures and information from Project Drawdown, so I'll usually have this little logo over here when I take a picture from them. Okay, agricultural land use in the US. These are some maps that come from Bloomberg.com. And I put the writing on there, but the blocks of color here are from the maps themselves. And you can see that it's divided into various things. Here's livestock feed, 127 million acres. Here's the food we eat. It sort of looks like Ohio, but it's not. It's 77 million acres. 3.4% of the US land is used for food we eat. 17% of all the US land, and this is not Alaska or Hawaii, continental US, is cropland, okay? 3.4% of the total, not of the 17, of the total is used for food we eat. 1.7% of US land is used for corn that is turned into ethanol. So the food we eat uses a fairly small fraction of our land, but generates 67% of the calories we eat. Grazing and the feed crops, that is growing crops like corn and soybeans to feed animals, uses 40% of US land, but accounts for only 30% of the calories. So that means that grazing, basically raising domesticated animals, uses 12 times as much land as the other foods growing the other foods we eat, but basically provides only less than half of the calories. So again, we're using an awful lot of our nation's land to grow domesticated animals and only getting basically half the calories we get off of this 3.4% of the land. Corn-based ethanol, as I said, 1.7% of the US land. And corn-based ethanol sounds like a good idea. It sounds like it would really be, using a natural product to make ethanol instead of using gasoline for pure gasoline for our vehicles. But when all is said and done, corn-based ethanol produces more carbon dioxide emissions than if we just used gasoline. So this is a really bad use of our land. And yet it's really entrenched right now because a lot of the farmers here in the Midwest are growing corn that's turned into ethanol. And so there's a ton of lobbying to keep that, pipeline of money flowing. So it's going to be very hard to get rid of that. Agricultural water use, very wasteful. Irrigation of various crops uses 70% of all global fresh water. And although you think of Earth as a watery planet, most of that water is salt water, not that much fresh water. Irrigation uses 70% of it. Irrigation in arid regions like this allows crop growth, which is great. That's why people irrigate in the first place. But the overuse of water is becoming critical. For example, I know many of you have read about water issues with the Colorado River. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the Ogallala Aquifer, which runs down the middle of the country. Here's Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, etc. And this aquifer deep underground runs basically from north to south, all the way down through New Mexico and Texas. And this has been the source of irrigation water for many, many farms for years. And back when I was teaching intro bio at University of Maryland, and this would have been, I don't know, maybe 1997 or 98, I told my students about this and said, Kansas, here's Kansas. Kansas has been issuing warnings that farmers need to restrict their water use or the Ogallala Aquifer is going to start to run dry. Okay, that was 1998. They're still pumping like crazy out of there. And so that's going to run out. And then it's going to be like, well, what? Where's our water? People, as you already know from climate change, have a very limited ability to see into the future and see the outcomes of problems that they're causing in the present. So there's a lot of water loss to evaporation when it comes to irrigation. So here's one of these big center pivots that's what generates these circles. So here's the center, and the sprayer rotates around like this, or only maybe goes in half of it in this case. But there's a lot of evaporation. So up to 40% of the water is lost to evaporation in center pivot irrigation. There are miles and miles of irrigation canals in California. And I know I've talked in previous webinars about how great it is that some of these are now being covered with solar panels. So that reduces the evaporation, but there's still, a lot of evaporation. One statistic, and here's the citation for that: covering the irrigation canals in California with solar panels could save 63 million gallons of fresh water a year. That's a lot, okay? That would make a big difference. And all those solar panels would generate a lot of electricity. Improving soil health, and this is good news, will help reduce the need for irrigation. When you have healthy soil, it holds a little water and you don't need as much irrigation. So that's good news. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. It was first started to be used in a big way about 1940, and then started to increase in 1950 and has really skyrocketed since then. This fertilizer causes the emissions of nitrous oxide, that's N2O, it's a greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, and nitrate, NO3, so 1 nitrogen, 3 oxygens. It's a soluble substance and it's a big water pollutant. And here you can see because of all the people don't have healthy soil, a lot of water runs off and it goes straight down the Mississippi. And here it is coming out the Louisiana Delta, depositing a lot of sediment. Here's basically soil that used to be in Iowa. And with it is coming a lot of water pollution from fertilizer, pesticides, chemicals, et cetera. So the nitrogen use on corn has just skyrocketed in the last 50 years. And this is in the US. In 1964, farmers used about 58 pounds an acre of nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. 2018, 147 pounds an acre. Not quite, but almost 3 times as much. Farmers will need less fertilizer and they'll save a lot of money if they rotate corn with soy, because soy is a legume and so it helps deposit nitrogen in the soil. And here's a figure that I included in my report. So if you want to know where this came from, you can download that report and go to page 24 and 25. There's several examples here. And you'll be able to get the reference so you can go back to the original paper and find this if you want. But here's an example. So if farmers use this much fertilizer, which is a little less than what they used in 2018 on average, this on fields where there's continuous corn, that is year after year, corn, then they get about this much yield, 100, maybe 140 bushels an acre. If they were happy to basically get a lower yield, excuse me, let me restate that. They could maintain the same yield and use a lot less fertilizer, okay? They would only have to use 40 pounds of fertilizer per acre if they rotated corn, soybeans, corn, soybeans. So I didn't say that very well. But the idea here is that they could get the same yield and use only 22% of the typical amount of fertilizer that they would use on corn if they did corn every year. Or let's say they really wanted more yield. They could bounce the yield up to this, okay, with corn after soybeans, bounce the yield up to this, use the same amount of fertilizer as this, even though, they could get the same yield without it. 17% more yield, but they have to use 360% more fertilizer. So fertilizer does cost some amount of money, and I haven't run the numbers, but this doesn't seem to be a very good trade-off. A little bit more yield for 3.5 times more fertilizer. And of course, that's more water pollution, air pollution, et cetera. Farmers also need less fertilizer if they boost soil organic matter. And there's an example and a graphic of that in my report on, I think that's on page 25. Okay, so it would be really great if farmers could make use of whatever strategy is possible to use less synthetic nitrogen fertilizer so it doesn't all wind up in our waterways causing certain nutrient pollution. All right, now an obvious solution to most of these problems with agriculture is to reduce food waste. Now, I have harped on this relentlessly in several webinars, but reducing food waste is one of the 2 absolute top strategies for reducing climate change, individual strategies for reducing climate change. So the US wastes 40% of all food grown. That means 16% of all US croplands are used to grow food that nobody eats. That's a waste. We don't need that. We don't need that acreage. 18% of all fertilizer is used to grow crops we don't eat. That's 3.9 billion pounds of nutrients that basically go into the waterways and also generate a lot of nitrous oxide. 6.1% of all US greenhouse gas emissions annually are caused by growing food we don't eat. That's 37 million passenger vehicles basically a year. And, we don't need to generate wasted emissions like that. And 21% of the US agricultural water usage is used to grow food we don't eat. So obviously, this is a pretty direct way to reduce emissions from agriculture. This is, of course, all of this waste is costing us $428 trillion. That's a lot of money, okay? 1.3, now more than that, almost 1.5% of the gross domestic product. Now, I'm going through this because you can help. This is something you can help with because the largest source of food waste is in our homes. It's all that food we forget in the back of the fridge, etc. So if you don't buy food that you're not going to use, then that basically helps reduce all of this, waste, basically. So that seems like a pretty obvious solution. Agriculturally oriented solution is basically found in the practices that are now called regenerative agriculture, but these are not new practices. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, which is a wing of the USDA, has been trying to get farmers to use these 4 practices: keeping the soil covered all year round, keep a plant in the soil all year round, minimize soil disturbance, maximize crop diversity, and maintain living roots all year round. These are the sort of 4 sacred practices of the NRCS. Recently, they've added integrating livestock. I think that was under pressure because there's a lot of information, and some of this I'm going to share with you today, that really calls into question whether integrating livestock is all that great of a thing or not. But what is a great thing is that boosting soil health is the absolute top, no regret strategy for increasing agricultural resilience to climate change. A no regret strategy is one that you're happy to do whether or not it helps with climate change or not, but because it does a lot of other good things. But it definitely helps with climate change. So it's you're getting more for the investment than it might seem at the beginning. Okay, I did give a webinar on soil at the beginning of the year, but I know everyone has forgotten that already. Maybe some of you didn't come. So here's a real quick refresher in one slide about what healthy soil is. Healthy soil, we don't see these aggregates, has an aggregate structure, which means there's a lot of little teeny tiny soil particles down there. But they're organized into these aggregates, and in the aggregates there are little teeny tiny pores, there are big pores, and there are intermediate pores. And so this water runs down through these pore channels because there's a lot of these aggregates all together, and water can be stored in these little pores. That's what this shows. Water can be stored in the little pores. These aggregates provide a habitat for soil diversity, biodiversity. Here you can see there's a mite and a lot of other things crawl around in there. The aggregate structure allows water to infiltrate, that is, soak into the field and then drain out by going down instead of running off. And this reduces erosion and runoff, and it also helps to prevent flooded fields. So here's a picture that's in my report. And basically what we want is this, where water soaks in and goes down into the water table, not this, where water runs off the top of the field and never soaks in, okay? So the water that are in these little pores can be accessed by plant during dry periods, so that helps during droughts. So healthy soil helps during floods and during droughts. The final point I want to make is that humus, which is sort of heavily decomposed organic matter, is found in these little spaces, little tiny spaces between the soil particles inside the aggregate. So this is a much bigger blow up of this. And microbes can't really get at the organic matter that's in those tiny spaces. But if you break the aggregates, say through tillage, then this organic matter is released, and the microbes then start to chew it up. After they do that, they release a lot of the carbon as carbon dioxide. So we want to keep these aggregates intact to prevent the microbes from being able to eat all of the soil organic matter. All right. So as a bonus, it turns out that the NRCS practices that increase soil health also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I did a lot of work on this that I included in that report, which again, if you're interested in that, you can read. But using Comet Planner and another program called CARPE by Dr. Moore, I was able to calculate the number of metric tons of carbon dioxide per acre per year that is reduced by each one of these practices. So you can scrutinize this, but I'll go through and indicate a few examples as we go through the next few slides. Okay, so one of the premier regenerative agriculture practices is no-till. And in no-till, the seeds are planted right into the residue of the previous crop. This is soybeans planted into, it looks like ryegrass or some kind of grass. And so you see the plants coming up, and here's the old crop. In contrast, under regular tillage, it might take between 4 and 6 passes of a field to first, break up the cover crop or the soil, and then, successive passes sort of pulverize the soil into finer and finer bits until it looks like this. And this is what breaks up the aggregate. So that's why tillage is not a really great idea. No-till prevents that breakage. Also in no-till, there's not a lot of disturbance of earthworms and other things, and we get root channels, which then serve as conduits for water and nutrients to soak in. In tilled soil, you get this pulverized soil at the top, but then at the depth of the bottom of the plow, you get sort of hard plow pan, and no water basically goes below that. So it really is a bad scene for root growth. Some of what roots grow way down here, and also soil organisms. So the problems with no-till are that if you're not out there tilling, and you don't have a really good sort of something in between the rows like that, weeds can spread. And so without tillage, this increases herbicide use. Also, herbicide is usually, or often, not always, often used to kill cover crops before the cash crop is planted. I'll show you an example of when the cover crop is killed mechanically in just a minute. But the issue, it's really a problem, is that a farmer can do no-till for years, and then one bout of tillage can undo all the years of accumulation. And there was a really, I started reading this periodical called No-Till Farmer. And in No-Till Farmer, there was this really sad article about how a farmer somewhere in the Midwest was renting out some of his fields, and another farmer made a mistake and thought that one of these fields was one that he had rented from a different person. And he went in there and plowed it and did tillage. And it just completely undid everything. So, this was in strip till farmers, same outfit. 30 years of building soil health undone with one pass, really tragic. But the problem is that we need to keep in mind is that, people can be doing no-till, and then, they decide, we're going to till to get rid of these weeds. And then there go all the benefits of the previous years. When it comes to the greenhouse gas reduction that I was telling you about before, this is a cropland management practice. About a half a metric ton of carbon dioxide per acre is reduced by no-till. Okay, so 100 acres then would remove 51 metric tons. That's not million tons, it's metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. This is just the soil effects that I told you about when the microbes chew up the organic material. This is like removing 11 cars from the road for 1 year. That might not seem like a big thing, but if you have, thousands of acres, it adds up. Okay, no-till also cuts emissions by reducing fuel. Okay, all those passes, 5 or 6 passes it takes to plant corn in a regular tilled system like this, that burns up fuel because that tractor is using fuel the whole time, right? If all U.S. farmers used no-till, it would save 763 million gallons of diesel fuel a year. That's equal to the energy used to heat and cool 2.8 million homes. Now, that's not chump change, right? It would cut emissions from the ag sector by 8.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. That's like removing 1.7 million cars. So the soil benefits, maybe not that much, but the savings in fuel is big. So for 100 acre field, that would save 416 gallons of diesel, or 4234 I don't think it's million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. This is like removing 921 cars. I'll check that, but it's not million. It's just 44,000 metric tons per year. And if you want to read about it, you can go to this link later. No-till also saves money by reducing labor. I'm sorry. Let's see. Right, this is reducing fuel. I'm sorry. Hello. So I already said this. For saving fuel, 4.16 gallons per acre at $3.50 a gallon is going to save $1,450 per pass. And if a farmer avoids 4 passes by going from this conventional to this, that saves $5,800 for 100 acres. Somebody has to drive that tractor, so many farmers do it themselves or they hire somebody to do it. And doing no-till would save $193 in labor for every avoided pass, given an estimate of how long it takes to, do the pass on that 100 acres. 4 avoided passes for planting saves $772. So the total savings for a 100-acre field is $6,500. That is, again, not chump change. Okay, so it saves time, it saves money, no-till saves time and money and improves soil health. So it's really kind of a triple benefit. Okay, no-till also reduces runoff, erosion, flooding, and water pollution. Okay, so these are environmental benefits. Here's a table that I included in my report. 4 years of monitoring. There was a certain amount of rainfall in each year that these people kept track of, and they monitored the runoff in inches. From moldboard is a method of plowing. Okay, runoff for moldboard plowing on average was I don't know the unit. 7.7, about 7 inches. 7 inches off of a field of a certain size, whereas the runoff from no-till on a field of the same size was, less than 1/10 of an inch. Huge difference. Okay, runoff from no-till was only 1.2% that seen in tilled fields, and instead of running off, it soaks in. So that's a bonus for the farmer, right? They're not losing all of that water. After a heavy rain, this is a little gizmo that USDA rigs up to see basically what the runoff looks like from a field. So here you see a field it's been tilled, and there was a heavy rain, and the water is basically just flying off of this field. It's muddy, which means it's carrying a lot of sediment. This is the farmer's topsoil, basically, that's running off. No-till can reduce the erosion of sediment, topsoil, by 4,000 pounds an acre. Okay, that is huge. Less runoff means less flooding, okay, and less loss of topsoil. Because runoff is reduced, so is water pollution from the sediment, but also from fertilizer and agricultural chemicals. So it is really helpful to keep that sediment and the water in the field, let it soak in, rather than letting it run off. Okay, the next practice that NRCS recommends is cover crops. And cover crops have a whole boatload of benefits. They add a cover crop. Let me just say what a cover crop is. A cover crop is a crop that is planted either into a standing cash crop or after the cash crop. And it's used to enrich the soil, provide weed control, etc. So here's a rye cover crop. Rye is a type of grass. It can get up to 6 feet tall. I don't know how tall this is. This farmer is doing double duty here. He's got what's called a roller crimper on the front of the tractor. That's a heavy cylinder with ridges on it, which knocks down that ryegrass and then basically crimps it so it kills it. Okay, here's some rolled ryegrass, and he's pulling his no-till seeder. So he's going through the field. He's smashing down the cover crop and planting at the same time. And here's the soybeans that came up in that field with the smashed down, killed ryegrass in between, which is doing a good job on weed control. Okay, so cover crops add organic matter. They help with the mycorrhizae. That's the fungal, the good fungi underneath within the soil. It adds nitrogen if you plant a legume. Suppresses weeds, suppresses nematodes, reduces erosions, increases infiltration of water, decreases nutrient loss through runoff, and some of the cover crops like clover will attract beneficial insects. So really a great practice. This is a cover crop which is used more and more. It's called a tillage radish. This it's like a daikon radish, but it's used in this setting because they have these long, long roots that go down, and those sort of open up the soil. So tillage radish is often planted in soils that are heavy with clay and to sort of help get them going. On average, cover crops reduce greenhouse gases by about almost half a metric ton of carbon dioxide per year. So it's about the same as no-till, a little bit less. Okay, cover crops increase soil health, and they do more. Cover crops increase infiltration, reduce runoff, flooding, and erosion. So here's a picture with no cover crops, and you can see there's a big erosion gully right there. Here is where tillage radishes were planted in the fall. Here's the remains of a few of those radishes. And you can see that the soil is not eroding in the same way. Many farmers plant cover crop mixes with maybe up to 14 species of different kinds of plants in there. So there's crimson clover here, there's some grasses. So you get a lot of benefits from these different kinds of plants. Increasingly, here's an example of a field on the Eastern Shore. This is a picture from Jim Lewis, who recently retired as an extension agent. But on the Eastern Shore, it's about 8 or 9 years ago, many cornfields were, of course, planted after tillage, and they were flooded like this. A lot of farmers had to replant their corn because the water didn't soak in, because the field had been tilled and the soil was not very good, and so it just flooded. It didn't run off because of the way the field slopes. So a lot of people are adopting this plan of, say, having the corn is growing like this, okay, it's already been planted. Then they go in afterwards. I don't know what kind of cover crop they had before, but most of it seemed to be gone. And they plant a new cover crop, in this case, clover, 3 little rows of clover in between every row of corn. So they have these interseeders, they're called, that are high enough up so that they don't smash down the cash crop, in this case, the corn. But you can get the cover crop going when the corn is just little, and then it really fills in and starts helping with weed control and whatnot. So you can give cover crops a good start by interseeding. Cover crops pay. The return under normal conditions, it might take 3 years. The first year, there's a lot of expenses with cover crops. You have to buy the seed, maybe you have to arrange for renting or buying an interseeder or whatever. So there's usually a loss during the first year. But by the third year, cover crops are saving almost $18 an acre. But in special situations, for example, if the farmer has herbicide-resistant weeds, a lot of soil compaction, or if it's a drought year, then cover crops really help a lot. You can see that with herbicide-resistant weeds, the loss the first year is not nearly the same as in normal conditions. And by year 2, the farmer's making a profit after planting cover crops, and a much bigger profit than in normal conditions if there are herbicide-resistant weeds. Soil compaction, same thing, loss during the first year, not as big, but a gain by the year 3 and year 5. A drought year, this is when cover crops really pay. They have a positive return in the first year and a huge positive return by the 5th year. So when the states or the federal government provide incentives to plant cover crops, that speeds the positive return, of course, because farmers are getting paid to plant the cover crops a certain amount per acre. And an example is Maryland's cover crop program, really successful. Many farmers enroll in this and get paid, I can't remember how much per acre, but it's enough to cover expenses. And that helps them out, but it also helps all of us out by increasing the use of cover crops. So when I drive around and I see fields that in the winter that are just standing there bare, having been tilled, I'm thinking, they should have planted cover crops. Okay, no-till and cover crops together work really well. This is a great picture that shows a field that had no-till and cover crops on the left, and a field that was just regular tillage on the right. So you can, I think there's some cash crop is coming up here, and here's corn over here, and a lot of bare ground. Again, there's one of these little gizmos on each side that channels the water down into a ditch, and you can just see by looking at the ditch, basically, that the no-till and cover crop field, there's less water coming out, okay, less water's running off, and it's not as filled with sediment as in the field that had regular tillage, did not have a cover crop and did not use no-till. So here's the large amount of muddy water coming off of this regular tillage field. I mean, this is a real difference. In 2019, there were those huge floods in the Midwest. And here's a picture that was published in various places. Flooding in spring 2019 in an Iowa field that was tilled and left fallow without a winter cover crop. So for some reason, they till in the fall. They often fertilize in the fall out in the Midwest, and then they just leave the ground bare, okay? This is asking for trouble. This is why all that sediment goes down the Mississippi. There's nothing to keep it from just running, the water from just running off or flooding the field. So this was a bad scene because farmers couldn't plant until, way late. This is all described in my report. Okay. Now, how many farmers in the U.S. use no-till and or cover crops? More than, we fear, but less than we want. Typical story. Here's no-till. You can see the yellow, 0 to 15% of farmers in these states use no-till. A lot of vegetables, for example, are grown in California, and no-till is just becoming popular in vegetable growing, but, I don't know what's going on in these other states. Tennessee's the big winner with 75% of the farmers using no-till. Maryland is pretty good using no-till, 60 to 75%, and this is in commodities. Cover crops. Again, Maryland is really good. 15% or more of the farmers are using cover crops. I think it's more like about 30% in Maryland. But, other parts of the country, cover crops aren't being used at all. A lot of the, breadbasket states, they're not using cover crops nearly as much as they could. And that would reduce all this water going down the Mississippi and elsewhere. So it would be really great if we could increase that. Increasing use of no-till and cover crops would reduce environmental impacts and make agriculture much more resilient to climate change by helping with floods and helping with drought. Okay, reduce the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and boost organic matter by adding manure or compost, okay? I just read this paper with a new strategy for dealing with manure, and that is to inject it into an early spring cover crop. So here's a manure, big tank of manure, and they're injecting it into these rows. You can see like this is where they've injected it, as opposed to just spreading it on the surface or injecting the manure later in the year. So this was shown to be a big bonus, and you can get that paper if you're interested. Here's the link. It's really important that farmers stop using sludge from wastewater plants as fertilizer. This has been done in Maryland. I know people who have done this, and that's bad because wastewater sludge, while it does, of course, include organic matter, it also includes those forever chemicals, PFAS, and I'm not going to be able to remember now what all these letters stand for, but everybody now knows what PFAS is. These are those forever chemicals, which are very bad for our health, and they're basically found in everyone. And a number of states are trying to outlaw the use of sludge from wastewater plants, but once a farmer uses it, these are forever chemicals, right? So it's there forever. Adding compost is a really great thing, but, years ago when I was working on that report, it was hard for farmers to get compost. It was in short supply in Maryland. I don't know if that's, gotten resolved now or not. So reducing synthetic nitrogen fertilizer by adding manure or compost. Has a less of an impact than cover crops or no-till, about half of the impact, but again, is helpful and reduces the essentially emissions of greenhouse gases by about 20%. Okay, now the so-called edge of field practices. That means they're not used in the fields where the crops are grown, but they're used on the edges. And there are a lot of different kinds. You can plant contour buffer strips like this. These can be either, these are adding herbaceous plants. That means plants that aren't woody. Planting along a stream, a riparian buffer. Filter strips are next to these might be woody, but then the filter strips are next to that. Grass waterways funnel the water down, a sort of grassy slope, and helps it soak in rather than going down into this wet stream. Riparian forest buffers, these are actually woody, but I'll be talking about those in just a minute. So there's a whole bunch of different options here. A really good one is to convert cropland to grass, forage, or biomass and then harvest it. Of course, if you don't have cropland anymore, it's going to be better than having cropland. More than half a metric ton per acre per year, a little bit less for converting cropland. Again, it's not as much. It's just these strips or little patches to permanent unfertilized grass or grass and legume cover. So this is planted and maybe it's mowed, but it's not harvested for anything. And the average of this is about half a metric ton per acre per year. Okay. Now, this is one of my favorites. This is an edge of field practice, or often used in between strips of, say, corn. These are called prairie strips, strips of native plants between larger strips of corn or soybeans. Here's corn, here's soybeans. There's a nice prairie strip. Those are really beautiful native plants. They attract pollinators and also natural enemies of pests, that is, insects and spiders that attack pest insects and reduce the need for insecticide. The deep roots of these native plants improve the soil and help sequester carbon. And it's been shown conclusively that having these strips of deep-rooted plants helps to filter out the chemicals and the sediment that might run off. These are, usually tilled, that might run off these tilled fields. If it runs down into a prairie strip, then a lot of it is intercepted and doesn't, run down into, the community or the road or whatever. You can see this is Iowa State is really big on these prairie strips. And I want to point out Dr. Lisa Schulte-Moore at Iowa State has been really instrumental in getting this going. And I'm so happy a couple of years ago, she won a MacArthur Prize for this work. It was just so creative, and she's followed through and really made it happen out there. And again, these water channeler objects, if you have 100% of crops, the water coming out is all filled with sediment. 90% of crops, 10% of prairie, it's a little bit better. 100% of prairie, the water basically comes out clean because it's all, the sediment is basically being intercepted by these plants. So this really works to keep, the erosion down, et cetera. So this is, again, all described in my report. Add woody plants. While we know that woody plants, Karen, I'm sorry, I can't deal with raising hands right now. So you can ask a question at the end. We know that woody plants store more carbon than herbaceous plants because the carbon is stored in the wood. One use of woody plants is in what's called hedgerows, where, small trees, well, I mean, large trees too, but trees and shrubs are planted in between cultivated fields. And it's even better if some herbaceous plants are planted on the edge between the field and the trees and shrubs. So this is a big bonus. And one of the papers I describe in my report shows that planting hedgerows increases pest control and pollination. This is added the pollinators and the natural enemies together, and this is just the pest control. But that saves money, right? If you don't have to control pests, because natural enemies are pouring out of these hedgerows to eat all of the problematic insects. That's good. Another edge of field practice is called alley cropping. Here's a picture of that. Here's some trees, and in between, the farmer's growing cotton. And so, again, the soil and the strips with the trees is really good, and water soaks down in, and it really helps. It helps reduce erosion and flooding. And then finally, silvopasture isn't on here. I don't know why. It should be in here with alley cropping. Silvopasture is raising domesticated animals in areas where there's grass or some other forage growing among a bunch of trees. And there are a lot of benefits of this, not just to the soil, but also to the cattle. You can read these bonuses at your leisure. Now, this is a big difference in terms of greenhouse gas reduction per year from all the other strategies that just involve not tilling or adding herbaceous plants. On average, the adding of woody plants reduces carbon dioxide emissions by over 5 metric tons per acre per year. Okay, the other ones were like half a metric ton or 0.2 of a metric ton. Adding woody plants is really helpful. Okay, now we got to come to grips with grazing. Remember that 41% of the US land area is used for grazing. And there's a lot of grazing on federal land. 155 million acres of our federal land, which belongs to all of us, is grazed, and it is not being treated very well. This is strongly degraded. This is a great report done by, oh, brother, I'm not going to remember what PEER stands for. I apologize if the PEER people are on the line. But you can access this report. It gives a lot of information about the kinds of damage that grazing is doing to our federal lands. Here is grazing. Here's a cowboy herding these cattle within a national park. And you can see that basically there's nothing growing here anymore because the cattle have basically destroyed it all. However, grazing on federal land is strongly defended by the Farm Bureau and by members of Congress in all farming states where the ranchers are living. And so it's going to be very hard to get this to stop, okay? But the 1.5 million grazing cattle on these acres of federal land, this is the largest use of public land, by the way, are trampling and overgrazing this fragile habitat. And I want you to remember that figure, 1.5 million cattle on these federal lands. Basically, the cowboys might herd them from pasture to pasture in different seasons, but they're basically just let loose and then they graze continuously on these large areas. This damage to the plants causes desertification. That's like this. Basically, there's not very many plants and everything dries up, and biodiversity loss, and it turns what could be a carbon sink, like a grassland like this, into a carbon source where carbon is being emitted with annual emissions equal to 3.3 million cars. That's a lot of cars, right? So grazing on federal land is really causing a lot of emission. The other thing is we're paying for this. The fees that are charged to these ranchers have been static for 40 years, and they're very low already. The Bureau of Land Management, who is in charge of managing this, they don't have enough people to even go around and assess how well the ranchers who have been granted these allocations are doing, whether they're protecting the land or not. And so they don't really know. And this is causing $100 million in losses per year. And this is described in an article in Inside Climate News. $100 million of losses per year. Where's that coming from? Our tax dollars. So not only are we destroying habitat, losing biodiversity, but we're paying through the nose for this. And the farmers and ranchers are not supporting their own, sort of enterprise. We're paying for it. Okay, now, I hear a lot about rotational grazing from various people. And I know it may seem to some of you like I really have it out for cattle and other animals, but it is sort of, it really can't be said too often that cattle are causing a lot of carbon emissions and a lot of biodiversity loss. So what is rotational grazing? here's what continuous grazing looks like. So here are a bunch of cattle inside a field, and these little brown areas are where manure has been deposited. And here's the water source. So you see in continuous grazing, a lot of the field really isn't getting any traffic from the cattle. They're all hovering around the water. And so this isn't a very efficient use of the land. Conventional rotational grazing divides up a big area like this, maybe into 4. And again, the stocking rate is such that the area near the water is heavily used, and this isn't used very heavily at all. And then there's regenerative rotational grazing. So I mean, it's just like raising rotational grazing to the power. And here the different paddocks have been divided into 3. So now there's 12 instead of 4, and they really cram those animals in there. And so the animals then eat all the plants. In this case, and in this case, the animals wander around and just eat the plants they like, okay? And they leave the rest of the plants. Here, they're stuck in there, and they eat the plants much more uniformly, including plants they don't like, which would become weeds. So moving the animals more frequently among smaller plots make the cattle eat the plant species more uniformly, and more of the field is recovering at any given time. So if they leave the animals in these paddocks for a certain length of time, more of the field is recovering. Now, the thing with this is the person running the operation has to go there and pay close attention to the cattle and move them before they completely run out of food. And that means there's a lot of interaction between the farmer and these different paddocks. It's labor intensive. It produces some carbon sequestration. I'll show you that in a minute, that offsets the cattle methane emission. But soil carbon is hard to measure, and it can be temporary, so it's really not that big of a bonus. But what strikes me is the sort of level of effort required. You got to have the fencing, you got to move the animals, you got to keep up with it, you got to make sure you don't leave them in there too long, etc. Very labor intensive. I think it's possibly workable for small farms, but I seriously doubt that large cattle ranches are going to be doing this. Ranches that have thousands of acres, they just let their cattle go, and then they move them around every few months. And it's not going to eliminate the problem of grazing on federal land. So I hear an awful lot about how this is going to really save us, but I'm sorry, I don't think so. Okay, there are no detectable climate benefits from grazing in terms of these reductions of greenhouse gases. If we look at prescribed or rotational grazing, that's what I just showed you. In Maryland, hardly any, less than less than 1/10 of a metric ton of carbon dioxide per year, okay? However, seeding adapted perennial or self-sustaining forages to improve grassland is a useful strategy, and that can be half a metric ton, just like as good as no-till, okay? So even rotational grazing provides almost no climate or soil benefit, but planting adapted grasses to improve the forage does help. But then again, that requires a lot of management. So what we see here are some pictures of, continuous grazing and what happens to the plants. Okay, another example. And here's the same area when the cattle are excluded. And you can see that the grass has grown back, there's little shrubs, and same thing down here, recovery of the plants and biodiversity. Here's another picture. Again, everything is basically eaten up, and here's what it looks like, excuse me, if grazing is stopped. And if you want to read more, you can go to this paper. Okay, is grass-fed beef the answer? Grass-fed beef and rotational grazing. I hear this all the time from people. This is what's really going to save us. I don't think so. This is from this is the article, okay? It's open access. You can read it if you want to. This guy, Jason Rountree, is one of the big proponents of rotational grazing. So this is a very positive article about rotational grazing. And there's conventional, basically these are confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs. That's what you get in the brown, carbon dioxide emissions over here. And there are more emissions per weight on a rotational grazing setup, but Roundtree et al. Claim that there's so much soil carbon sequestration that this is reduced to less than what you would get in a regular feeding arena. However, rotational grazing requires more than twice as much land. So for poultry, pork, and beef especially, there's more than twice as much land needed for rotational grazing than needed for conventional raising of the beef. So it's pretty hard for me to justify saying we need twice as much land now for grazing as we already are using. And again, for more on regenerative grazing, there's a nice article from the Drawdown folks. Okay, how about food additives? Can food additives solve beef's methane problem? You know that one of the big problems with beef, besides what they're doing to the landscape, is that they burp out methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is about 20 times more potent in causing climate change as carbon dioxide. And this is, again, an article written by the people at Drawdown. And here's a whole bunch of different feed additives. And the demonstrated CH4 is methane, the demonstrated reduction of methane for each one, and then the risks and drawbacks for each one. So it's a nice little table, has a lot of information. But the problem is that these feed additives that are, people are saying, oh, we don't need to worry about beef because we're just going to add feed additives and that's going to get rid of the methane problem. Nope. You can see there's a whole, I don't know how many, 7 of these things. And the demonstrated average methane reduction goes from minimal to 32%. That's the most. And some of these are, 11%, variable, 10%, et cetera. So less than 32%. And here are the different additives. And not only does it not really work very well, okay, but all of them have some kind of downside, so risks and drawbacks. Sunflower oil, it can decrease milk production, appetite, and growth. Well, what farmer wants to use that to get a less than 20% reduction in methane? That's going to cost the farmer money. I don't know exactly what this is, but it also causes the same thing, basically reduced milk production. Nitrate can convert to nitrite and poison the ruminants. That's not a benefit. And it can increase nitrous oxide, of course. This stuff can lead to, it must be an antibiotic, can lead to antibiotic resistance. We don't need that because we want to be able to go to the doctor and get antibiotics that work. We don't want to throw them away trying to reduce methane in cattle. This one had moderately okay sort of success in reducing methane, but it increases emissions from the manure. Okay, so now we're getting a loss. Tannins, higher doses can be toxic. Garlic oil, promising but toxic at higher doses, and it can cause polio in cattle. Who knew? So when you read, we can just solve the cattle problem by giving them food additives, go to this paper and read more. But I'll just say this is not going to work. Okay. Now, what about so-called climate-friendly beef? It turns out that Tyson is marketing this stuff called brazen beef. I had to laugh at that name because it's like a brazen bunch of greenwashing, basically. Supposedly, it has 10% less emissions. They advertise it, better beef, better planet, climate-friendly, grass-fed, yay, 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 everything's wonderful. No guilt, you can just eat all you want. 10% less emissions. Okay, that's really not going to help that much. But there was this outfit who tried to probe a little more to find out more information about what was really going on. And so they did a Freedom of Information Act request to get the data that is supposed to back this up. And all the pages were redacted. There's nothing there. All the information was removed. So that's pretty unsatisfying. But the Brazen Beef website, are talking about how great they are and how responsible they are. If we're showing up for the climate, we've got to show our work. Without supportive hard data, any product that claims to be a sustainable, climate-friendly, or low-carbon alternative to the status quo is vulnerable to greenwashing skepticism. Well, what do they say when you try to get the data and it's all redacted? That sounds to me like they're trying to cover something up. it might be of interest to some of you to read this article, The New Merchants of Doubt, okay? The corporate playbook by big meat and dairy to distract, delay, and derail climate action. If those of you who are older might remember the original Merchants of Doubt, which was the tobacco industry, and all they went through to keep regulations from hitting their industry. Well, that's what's happening in the beef industry now, the new Merchants of Doubt. What about climate-friendly beef? The studies used to support braised beef were done by this professor, Frank Mitloehner, who's a professor at UC Davis, and a student of his, and they were all funded by the beef industry. In fact, this guy runs a big center to study beef and, grass-fed beef, et cetera, and it's all paid for by the beef industry. So I have to say, that seems like a big conflict of interest to me. And I read this guy's papers, total mumbo jumbo, okay? I read a lot of scientific papers, and this was, vacuous. Mitloehner's student, person who co-wrote this, now heads sustainability for JBS, one of those big multinational meat organizations that's responsible for cutting down a lot of the Amazon for soybeans and pasture for beef. And I read her life cycle analysis of beef emissions, more total mumbo jumbo, absolute junk, okay? Sorry. Now, we just don't get enough food value from livestock to justify the environmental damage. I've shown you guys this picture before, and I'm not going to belabor it now. Just take the point. A solution, shift to a plant-based diet. We know this works. Here's a graph from our World in Data. I know I'm running a little late. Indulge me for just a few more minutes. Global land use for agriculture across different diets. Here's the current global diet. A lot of it is pasture, okay? A lot of it is used for animal feed. This much, it looks like, I don't know, 15% used for human food. Here's a diet, no beef or mutton. You still can get beef from dairy cows. So old dairy cows that don't produce much milk are usually slaughtered for beef afterwards. So that's, at least a usage there. That cuts the use of pasture way down, okay? Because you don't have as many beef. No beef, mutton, or dairy, then you're down here, okay? So we're way down on plants. No red meat, dairy, or poultry, a little bit. Vegan, a little bit. But as I've said before, you don't have to adopt a vegan diet, which is, pretty, I drink milk. Okay, I drink milk in my coffee. Sorry, people. But you don't have to be a vegan to make a big difference. You could do, no beef or mutton and still reduce land use. No beef, mutton, or dairy, you're really doing good, okay? So we know shifting to a plant-based diet will reduce the use of land for pasture and growing beef. What if we could regain some of that land that is currently being used for grazing and feed? How much land is that? Well, if we consider just 25 to 75% of what's currently grazed, that's 197 to 588 million acres. That's a lot of land. And here's those same pictures I showed you before. If we could allow that land to regenerate naturally for biodiversity restoration, and that's what I showed you in these pictures where the cattle were excluded and everything's growing back. We could replant grasslands or forests to restore biodiversity and sequester carbon, and this would be on cropland that's currently used for feed, or pasture that is planted in an area that, where the prairie has already been removed or something. Replant grasslands or forest as appropriate on this cropland that's being freed up. You don't want to plant trees in areas where the cropland was originally in prairie, for example, so as appropriate. You could establish or expand parks. I mean, we'd have a lot of land to be doing, restoration of biodiversity, rewilding, all the things we've been talking about. Now, it might be really easy to make this swap on federal lands, but private landowners are probably going to want to be paid to do that because they're having to give up their source of income, which is cattle. So it would be useful to have federal or state incentives to stop the grazing. But it would be pretty cool to get all this land back and be able to regenerate so much biodiversity. Another solution to our current agriculture problem is diversification of agriculture. So here's an industrialized vineyard where there's rows and rows and rows of vines. Here's a diversified vineyard where it's planted in between, smaller fields in between a bunch of other stuff, okay? Industrialized, diversified, really big difference. And this is just I thought, a beautiful little cartoon. Where here are the triple threat of problems we have: climate change, biodiversity loss, and food insecurity. So diversification like this, okay, here's monoculture, here's 10% prairie strips. Diversification increases biodiversity. Having more trees and native perennials stores carbon, and diversity of crops reduces risk. If one crop doesn't make it this year, then another crop does. But diversification is more effort, right? And it eliminates the economies of scale. And this is what corporate agribusiness likes. They like the economy of scale. They like these big fields where you can just, back and forth do the same thing, not have to work around a bunch of other plants. So as long as we have corporate agriculture, this is what we're going to have, okay? But in areas where the farms are smaller and they can be more diversified, we'll have a lot more restoration of biodiversity and a lot more, it says less runoff, less soil export, less phosphorus export, less nitrogen export. So it's really good to have a diversified setting. Now, carbon sequestration on cropland, probably not. That's probably not going to save us. Depleted farmland could store a lot of carbon, but measuring soil carbon is really difficult. And detecting significant changes in soil carbon among fields requires a huge sample size, which is expensive, and 3 to 5 years. So it's really hard to say, we're going to sequester a bunch of carbon and I'm going to show you how well it works. Well, it's going to cost you and take a lot of time. I already mentioned soil carbon accumulated over many years can be lost. Agroforestry is probably the best bet for increasing carbon storage. I already said that. So here's alley cropping where there's trees and there's some crop in between. This is silvopasture where we've got the cow wandering around among the trees. And then here's sort of restoring prairie. Much more carbon could be sequestered if we reduce the cropland needed for grazing, reforest it, or convert it back to prairie. So this is the last sort of slide with any info on it. How about selling carbon credits? Maybe you've read about the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market. This is not going to help us either. Carbon credits do incentivize regenerative practices. The way it works is farmer is able to sell one credit for every 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide prevented or stored in the soil. This provides funding to farmers to help defray their costs, but when they sell carbon credits to corporations, those corporations basically cancel out a bunch of their pollution with the carbon credit. So here's a metric ton saved. Okay, that cancels out a metric ton of pollution that we're still putting out into the atmosphere. Agribusiness is using regenerative ag to greenwash. They claim they are helping to reduce climate change, but they are not changing their own polluting practices. And I got a ton of stuff for you to read here. I didn't have time either in prep or now to talk in more detail about this. But if you're interested in learning more, you can, when you get the slide handouts, you can click on all these. And here are 2 articles from Drawdown with much better solutions than basically trying to sell carbon credits or even trying to store carbon in the soil. Storing carbon in the soil to reduce climate change is not going to be the big plus from regenerative agriculture. Okay, is the USDA helping? No. Crop insurance rules from the USDA don't cover most sustainable practices. So crop insurance only basically is written for big commodities and monocultures. And there's no flexibility for many sustainable practices like those that build soil health and reduce risk. So these big, farms with giant monocultures are raking in crop insurance when climate change causes floods, and we're paying for that. But little farms that are trying to do something are not getting any money. You might have heard about climate smart agriculture. I would say most of the climate smart agricultural practices supported by the Inflation Reduction Act are not climate smart. 8 of the 15 strategies funded in 2020 don't benefit the climate, yet they got 37% of the funding. Here's one: manure lagoons. Manure lagoons were supported by IRA funding as a climate-smart agricultural practice, but they do not benefit the climate. Most of the $2.8 billion for climate-smart commodities in 2023 went to giant corporate farms or corporations like JBS and Tyson. That really depresses me. And even apart from the Inflation Reduction Act funding, there is not enough basic USDA funding for basic soil health practices. Farmers apply for help in implementing some of the, cover crops or no-till or whatever, and half the people who apply don't get any money. So again, it's all skewed towards big farms. And here's more that you can read if you want. Summary. Thank you for indulging me. I know I've gone over. Regenerative agriculture's focus on soil health is really important. The practices that boost soil health will reduce flooding, alleviate drought impacts, make agriculture more resilient to climate change. Current agricultural policies and lobbying are stifling progress. Thank you, agribusiness and the Farm Bureau. Carbon sequestration on cropland is impermanent and hard to measure. So really, I would not count on that being of much help. Woody plant practices may be of some promise. Selling carbon credits for cropland practices allows polluters to keep polluting. It's much better to fund soil health through federal and state incentives. So I know I've talked really fast, but I'm super happy to take some questions right now.